So the Mine Financial Security Program, or the MFSP, is essentially a regulatory regime that is intended or purported to be intended to protect Albertans from the costs of remediation and reclamation associated with both coal and oil sands mining. Although the proportion of the oil sands mining and those costs dwarf essentially any of the liabilities associated with coal. And so on paper anyways, or at least sort of at a very superficial level, the idea is that, these mining projects have, long lives, 50, sometimes 60 years. And that, in that context, they're displacing a ton of soil, wetlands, all this kind of stuff. And that at the end of that project life, there will be remediation reclamation costs that will have to be paid. That work will have to be done, and that will cost money. And so then the idea is supposed to be, and we have these problems. That's a normal problem. We know that that's in British Columbia, in Ontario, Quebec, all mines, metal mines, coal mines, oil sands mines, right? In all these contexts, there's this idea that at the end we have these, they're also referred to as asset retirement obligations. And so what we've realized though as well, because of the nature of business, commerce, capitalism, and then the idea that companies can go bankrupt, right? So a company can be doing well, but then suddenly prices take a downturn, they experience other kinds of hardship, and suddenly they shut down, and you have a mine in place with all these liabilities, outstanding remediation reclamation costs. And so across the board, governments create regimes that are intended to sort of deal with that risk, right? And the reality is that they all deal with that risk to lesser or more extent. And we can get into the details in a second, but the MFSP is probably the worst of all of these regimes in terms of how it's calibrated that risk and the risk that it's prepared to leave Albertans exposed to as opposed to industry, right? So that's a Mine Financial Security Program. It actually doesn't really collect security. What it does instead is it allows oil companies to rely on, whether we call them their assets or really our assets, because what we're talking about is reserves in the ground, right? So the value of the oil sands in the ground as collateral, essentially, against their liabilities. And so long as that asset to liability ratio is 3-to-1, we say that those companies don't then have to post that security. And so to your point exactly, what happens if there's a structural change in the market, the demand for oil changes in a radical way, and that affects price? Every one of these companies would suddenly have less assets, right? And then it's very possible then, essentially, that the system would then have a cash call on companies that are already financially distressed. So everything is being done now to minimize the costs on industry. So that industry, for instance, not only does it not have to invest actually in reclamation or remediation, but for instance, it doesn't even have to to get a letter of credit from a bank, which might affect its credit rating or its access to loans, to not even do that, right? So I've sat, virtually across the table from the regulator and said, that if one of these companies goes into bankruptcy, there is not enough money in the MFSP to cover their liabilities. Their response was, we assume that a subsequent operator would purchase the assets and assume the liabilities. Oh. And so then from there, you say, okay, well, what if you have that structural change and multiple operators are suddenly in financial distress? And that's the concrete that's the reality that they say, we have not designed this program to deal with that eventuality.